Dr. T. Donna Chen is an associate professor at the University of Virginia and a researcher at the Smarter Center. She joined UVA's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering in August of 2015. Her research focuses on transportation systems, particularly modeling the impacts of new vehicle technologies systems on traveler behavior and the environment, as well as travel demand modeling, transportation economics, and crash safety. Prior to joining academia, Dr. Chen worked in the consulting industry as a transportation planning engineer and has experience with roadway design, cost estimation, and traffic operation analyses. So, welcome, Donna.
Thank you for that kind introduction.
Of course. So, to get started here, given the novelty of some of the technologies we'll be talking about later today, I thought it would be useful for you to kind of introduce yourself intellectually to us. And to do so, I thought it would be interesting to ask you about your experience as a transportation planning engineer in the private sector prior to getting your PhD. So, tell me about that transition. Have you always had a sort of drive to engage with these questions around transportation systems more systematically, or were there parts of were there experiences early on in your transportation career that kind of encouraged you to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the kinds of technologies that I'm working with now, what is it, almost 20 years later, did not exist when I was a practicing engineer in the private sector. So these specific topics were not something I envisioned. But when I was working as a design engineer, I always wanted to understand, in terms of the design tables we were implementing or the policies we were implementing, the guidelines that we were following. I'm like, who makes those decisions? Who puts that information into that book? So I was always curious about that. And so initially I went back and did my master's in transportation engineering just to have a deeper understanding of the theory behind the equations, behind the tables. And as luck would have it, the deeper understanding I had of that, the more I thought, is there a way to even influence those design guidelines, those design policies? So that led to going back to school for the PhD for a career in research. And here I am, you know, 20 years later in academia.
Great. So when you connect those two experiences further, especially as you started to develop an interest in virtual reality and augmented reality, excuse me, two of the key technologies that we'll be focusing on here today, would you say that there was a through line in that interest to go sort of like beyond the theoretical models and begin sort of engaging with people's lived experiences or replicating them virtually?
Yeah, I definitely think my previous experience as a consulting engineer definitely planted that seed in my head. I wouldn't say that it was something that was immediate. I got into this virtual reality, augmented reality space through a collaborator here at University of Virginia who has that background in virtual reality. My research when I was a PhD student was actually on autonomous and electric vehicle integration in fleets. But I would say that one thing that you know, I really remember from my time as a consulting engineer was the times when we had to attend public involvement meetings and explain to the public the proposed design that, we as engineers made. And we went in there with the best of intentions, but we didn't have the tools to really thoroughly explain to the public what it was that we were trying to implement in this space that was, in their backyards a lot of times. And I think that a lot of times it felt like we were the enemy, like we were coming in and, changing up something that maybe they felt like didn't need to be changed. And we were just trying to show them our design plans that we had worked so hard on, that we had taken all this information and tried to make it the least environmentally impactful alternative, for example. But they didn't understand the jargon because we just brought all of our technical info with us, like, literally construction plans were like, here, look at the center line, look at the lane width. I mean, I think even at that time, I could feel that the public could not fully engage with the information that we were giving them, and we lost trust that way in a way that was really unnecessary because we didn't go in there with bad intentions, but I think oftentimes it was perceived that way. So that sort of feeling really stuck with me. And then when I saw so my colleague here was doing some virtual reality research looking at like building occupants and how they experienced different types of lighting design. And that stuck with me. I thought, well, we could do that with transportation design. We could look at how people would experience virtually different types of transportation design, and that would really enhance their understanding of what it is we're trying to present to them.
Absolutely. And so you're kind of alluding now to a particular project that you're pursuing right now with the Smarter Center.
Yeah.
That is this project that allows um, users to, or explores the implications for those involved in the public engagement process. And this is a process that's very widespread, not only in transportation design, but in urban planning and other forms of construction and design. Essentially, you're allowing uh, people to get sort of a sneak peek into what these projects might look like in the future.
Right.
Excellent. Yeah. And so would you say that like this technology increases the sort of transparency that your is afforded to people who are um might have some misgivings about the project?
So I do think that the underlying motivation behind this project and this line of research is, sort of gaining that public partnership. So in transportation, we are most of the time offering services to the general public, and we want to be able to build that trust and that community. So for this particular project, maybe I'll just address it now. We are looking at a project in Southwest Virginia where a community is about to have two roundabouts constructed in their downtown area. And the big deal here is that this community has zero roundabouts right now. So they're very unfamiliar with this concept, which makes it a really good candidate for something like virtual reality as a way to demonstrate because it is something that they're, unfamiliar with. So when they think about how they might engage with that infrastructure, if you were just to present them with, construction plans or maybe a pictorial illustration or even a video fly through, one, they might not understand fully what you're presenting to them, or two, if it's only from the perspective of, sort of the systems perspective, it might look good on paper, it might look good in a video, but they haven't experienced what it's like to engage with it. And so to understand some of these perhaps like growing pains when this facility first opens, I think it is, I don't want to say transparent because we've always given the information, but it's more understandable or more approachable to be able to have the participants be able to immerse themselves in this virtual environment as the user that they are going to be in the future, whether that's as a driver, as a pedestrian, as a cyclist, and they all engage with that infrastructure in different ways. So to be able to try that out in a virtual environment before it's implemented on the ground, I think provides great value. And I guess the hope here is, we're still in sort of the final design stage, that if there are, things that come out of the public meeting as, consistent complaints or consistent issues that arise with the participants, that there is still time for the design to be slightly altered to accommodate those kinds of things that come up.
Absolutely. And so I can see the kind of transferability here between your others that this project and your other smarter project, that being those related to um, understanding pedestrian well-being using similar kinds of wearable devices. So this isn't virtual or augmented reality per se, but you're using wearable devices to understand traveler responses to various aspects of the infrastructure. Would you introduce us to that project, please?
Sure. And I would say that the underlying theme across these projects, even though the second one doesn't have a VR AR component, is this idea of understanding transportation design from a user-centric perspective, right? So when we are using the VR for public involvement, we are also able to track their gaze, the eye tracking, the heart rate. We're able to ask them questions about if they feel unsafe or safe in particular spaces. And this is a very different idea than the traditional data collection we've had, thinking about like video data of real world observations, which tend to be very systematic centric, which is important, right? We need to understand what's happening at a systems level, but oftentimes we do miss the complexities of how individuals are actually interacting with those environmental cues. So when we are able to use these mobile devices, such as the eye tracking glasses or the VR goggles that have the eye tracking capability, smart watches with heart rate trackers, we are talking about being able to measure, like quantitatively and somewhat objectively, measure the experience someone has as they are going through an environment, some of it related to the transportation design decisions that we make as engineers and planners, and other things that are not necessarily specifically transportation related because the urban environment is complex. It's not just about traffic lights and crosswalks. It's also about things, feelings of personal safety that deal with land use and other contextual cues. So I think in that study, what we did was we identified a high risk pedestrian corridor in downtown Charlottesville, which is where the University of Virginia is located. And so this corridor had experienced higher than average pedestrian crashes historically. And we wanted to understand how pedestrians made their crossing decisions during day versus night conditions. You may be aware that pedestrian fatalities are on the rise, and particularly at night. So, it's on the rise in both times of day, but it's especially bad at night. So we really wanted to understand what's going on at night. Like, are these behavioral differences exist in the same people when it's the same corridor, day versus night. So we had them walk along this corridor and choose a crossing location. They had, I think, four different locations to choose from, and the four different locations had very different infrastructure characteristics. So one of them was at a signalized intersection with high visibility crosswalks and a push button with a pedestrian signal. We had two other locations that just had crosswalks, painted crosswalks, but with different lighting levels. And then we had one last location that just had a decorative crosswalk. So, kind of like a textured brick, no high visibility paint whatsoever. And we wanted to understand how these people were making these decisions day versus night, looking at both stated preference data. So we asked them after they completed their walk and after they crossed the street, you know, can you identify for us locations where you felt particularly unsafe? So they marked that down on us for a map, but also the actual quantitative metrics we can measure, which is their gaze variability, their head movement, their walking speed. Um, and what was really interesting is that we saw that there, first of all, people pay attention to very different things during day versus night. Maybe this is surprising, maybe it's not, but we actually found that at night they paid far less attention to unlit transportation infrastructure, so things like crosswalks. If it, wasn't part of a directly lit area, they don't really pay attention to that very much. We also saw that it varies a lot based on age and gender. And then when we look at the overall picture of what kind of factors contribute to their crossing decision, we found that in the daytime, the behavior is more consistent. So the provision of a pedestrian push button signal motivated a lot of people to cross at that location, which is what we want as transportation planners because it's by far the safest location for them to cross. But at night, there was just a slew of other factors. So that provision of the signal alone was not enough to encourage consistent behavior. We, in fact, saw more jaywalking behavior at night than we observed during the day, which you think, wow, that's really risky because they're even less visible at night. But people reported, a lot of interactions with lighting levels. So if their personal safety felt threatened, and we can see that with their increased gaze variability. At night, you also saw increase in walking speed when this happened. That was almost always an indicator that they were about to cross at the next available opportunity, whether it was safe or unsafe by metrics of transportation engineering.
Mhm. And were there any frictions between what you found in the stated preference surveys versus what would be suggested by some of the haptic feedback you got or the eye gaze data that you received? Anything that they said like, "Oh, I'm concerned about this," or "I'm not," that would be contradicted by the way they actually behaved in the environment?
So most of the time where they stated feeling locations where they felt unsafe, we did see a corresponding change in gaze variability. So for the most part, that was consistent. I think what it allows us to do though is, there's always some recall bias when it comes to, they completed that survey at the end. So they're telling us about the things that really stood out to them. But there are times when they exhibited behavioral cues that may indicate some kind of nervousness or at least heightened attention to the environment that they don't report because it was somewhat, it didn't make that deep impression on them, but we still see that. So I think these kinds of things, again, this is sort of an initial exploratory study, but we are seeing that there are physiological indicators. And one of the things that could be really exciting in the future is if we have this kind of indication of how pedestrians may interact with the environment in a future where, let's say, autonomous vehicles are trying to interact with pedestrians, that they may be able to take this kind of cues, physiological cues from the pedestrian and understand that they may be getting ready to make a decision or they may be getting ready to do something that's not, the current path they're on. And so we hope that in the future that interaction is both sided. One is that, we we have a deeper understanding of the type of infrastructure that pedestrians feel comfortable with, and we're able to provide that infrastructure, but also that if in the future vehicles are fully autonomous, that they have some kind of capability of at least detecting when a pedestrian may be changing their path or changing their behavior in a way that the vehicle would have to pay attention to avoid a collision.
And let's talk about some of those physiological responses and the challenges around interpreting them. So, like, what does fear and agitation look like, and how might that inform their behavior in the next, milliseconds, minute, whatever? Like,
Yeah.
how should this future autonomous vehicle that you're imagining, what should they be looking for, and how should they
Well,
respond?
I don't have a solid answer for that yet because as researchers would say, that is future research and that is
Mhm.
something we hope to be working on soon. But I will say that so the kinds of data that we collect in terms of gaze variability, which comes from eye tracking data, heart rate variability, which comes from smartwatch data, and you can also just track things like their physical walking speed, for example, so instantaneous changes in speed or acceleration. These have some right now we can what we can say is that it has some correlation, potentially indication to their situational awareness, which then could affect their behavior. Right now, I'm not sure that we have a direct translation between these indicators to things like, oh, where are they going to be positioned in space, XYZ? But it takes this initial step to be able to understand that this data can help inform that somewhere in the future. So I don't have a great answer for that right now, but I do think that this is a wide open area for future research.
Excellent. And before I ask my next question, I just want to remind the members of the audience that they can use the Q&A or chat functions to ask Dr. Chen any question they would like, and I'll try to work those in before the end of the program. Um, so, given some of those ambiguities around the physiological responses that you're collecting and the sort of nascent nature of this research, how do you think about this problem of like replicability and transferability when using tools like virtual reality or augmented reality or any of these wearable devices in research? How should we think about these limitations? Um, when comparing them with some of the observational studies or modeling studies that you discussed earlier? And is this really a concern? Like, is this maybe the best bad option that we have as far as, the limited insights that we can derive from these particular kinds of research?
So maybe I want to start there with this last part of your question, which is
Mhm.
what is virtual reality and augmented reality adding to the space when we have some traditional um, data collection methods that already exist. And then maybe we can address that part about, is the reproducibility a concern? Maybe what are some immediate pressing questions regarding to that realm? So I would say that from where I'm sitting, I'm looking at a question about how do we evaluate future infrastructure? So infrastructure that doesn't currently exist in the ground. And if you talk about real world data, real world observation data, which is, probably the most valid form we have. The issue with that is, well, you have to do it on infrastructure that exists, right? Video data collection of an existing environment. So it can't really apply to proposed environments unless you're thinking about before and after studies. And with before and after studies, we typically are talking about 2 to 3 years of data collection before the new infrastructure is implemented and 2 to 3 years of data collection after the infrastructure is implemented. So we're talking about a time frame of minimum of 5 years to assess the effectiveness of that proposed design in one location under the specific context of that location, right? That's the other issue with real world data collection is that you can't control the other variables very well. And as researchers, we know it's like, there's all these issues with these other variables that are random and we can't control, whether it's things like traffic volumes, the lighting, noise, weather. So it becomes also difficult to isolate what is the effect of a single variable. That being said, I think, no one's going to argue with the fact that no one's going to ask you, can you like validate your real world data collection? I mean, it's what's happening. So it is a very useful source, but perhaps limited for the kinds of applications, research applications that we're talking about. So traditionally, when we try to evaluate future technologies or future scenarios, we've been using survey data. And survey data is really good in that it's cheap, right? It doesn't take very long for someone to click through a web survey and give you some feedback. So you can get a really large sample size, and that is very useful. And I'm not here to say we shouldn't use survey data because we still use survey data as part of the complementary data collection in our VR AR research. However, the issue is that survey data suffers from hypothetical bias, and that is the discrepancy between what someone says they will do in a situation in a survey versus what they actually would do. If that was the real world. And some of this is non-intentional. It's because they're unfamiliar with this future design that you're proposing. So they envision, how would I interact with that future design? But they don't truly understand what the design is, right? It looks good, looks good in a picture, maybe sounds really good in a video. So they have good intentions, but in fact, their real interaction with it will be quite different. So I think the virtual reality, which allows us to virtually construct this future design pretty rapidly and relatively low cost, at least compared to real world construction costs, then allows this full immersion where we have somewhat decrease that hypothetical bias because at least everyone is experiencing the same virtual environment that we built for them rather than dealing with some figment of their imagination as they imagine themselves interacting with this future environment. However, like I mentioned before, surveys, they're really low cost and you can get large samples. We do suffer a little bit from a limited sample size when it comes to VR, AR experiments. I mean, we have to take the time to allow people to immerse themselves in these environments, and that is a bit more time consuming compared to a survey study. So you're going to have a smaller sample size than with survey. However, the good thing is because we're able to control for a bunch of external factors, so we can program in the exact traffic pattern so that everybody experiences the exact same traffic exposure. We can, control the lighting, control the noise. We can control many, many things with our different environments that in a way it's easier for us to isolate the impact of each particular variable, which makes the sample size issue not as big of an issue as it might be in another study. So there are trade-offs. I would say it's not a perfect methodology, but it offers a bit of a bridge between that real-world observation and the survey data collection, which I think right now, for the research purposes we have, it's just a really nice fit. So back to that, I will say whenever we do this research, people say, well, but it's not the real world. It's still virtual reality. How do you know that people aren't doing different things in virtual reality as they would in the real world? And I say, well, we can't, it's not meant to be an exact replica of their behavior. In fact, earlier on, when we were establishing the Omni Reality and Cognition Lab at UVA, we did a couple of benchmarking studies. So we took video recordings of people walking along this corridor in Charlottesville, and we also replicated that corridor in virtual reality and observed their crossing behavior in our lab. And what I can say is that the overall distribution of their behavior is very, very similar. And when you add a treatment, so let's say it's a crosswalk and we added rapid flashing beacons, for example, the relative change in their behavior was very consistent in virtual reality compared to the real world environment. Whether their absolute speed was exactly the same, no, there were some differences, but we could see that generally speaking, the core behavioral change we're trying to understand that was consistent between both sets of data. And so for that, I think if you're talking about something where you're looking at the direction of change rather than the absolute magnitude of change, I absolutely think that virtual reality can be a very effective way of capturing that. That being said, I think a couple of questions back, you asked about like, with these physiological data that we're collecting, whether it's the gaze variability and things of that sort, how do we know how to analyze this data in order to apply it towards transportation research and how to interpret this data. And I think that is one of the things that we are actively trying to figure out as we go along with the research. What I will say is that most of our metrics, the things that I've mentioned, like gaze variability, head movement, a lot of it comes from lab-based studies that have been done in other disciplines. So things like marketing. So they would traditionally, before there was this mobile eye tracking technology, you were talking about like wired headsets. People had to sit in a lab, look at a screen, and then they tracked what they paid attention to. And there is some differences with how people interact with these wearables in a lab setting versus in the wild, in the real world, where there's just more contextual factors, you know, competing for their attention, let's say. So right now we use sort of like thresholds for defining gaze as it's been done in previous lab-based studies because there isn't enough studies in the wild right now to really define what that could be for transportation research. But we are keeping our data, and we hope there are more researchers that will join us in doing this type of research so that we have some massive data sets and we can go back and say, should we be revisiting those thresholds? Like, is using just a threshold recommended by lab-based studies the smartest way forward, or are there some nuances in how we should analyze this data? So I do want to put this big caveat out there that the research is so new that there are still these exceptions that we're trying to work through.
Yeah. And when you talk about these technologies, I really get the sense of how jagged the frontier is. So I guess could you kind of map it out a little bit? Like you sort of started to a little bit, but kind of like what's the low-hanging fruit right now? What are the most uncertain paths forward for the technology as far as um, where we're applying these technologies to different fields of study? Is it maybe focusing more on things like safety, where people are going to act very differently in a virtual environment versus the real world? Something like that. What does the frontier look like to you right now?
I mean, I think it's really open. I think there are plenty of transportation researchers working in this space, but I think one of the things that's challenging for us is, again, our discipline historically has really rewarded a system-centric metric system. So, when we think about improvements in transportation, we're talking about things like measuring historic crash, actual crashes that occur, which is important. But I think when we think about proactive approaches to safety, like, is the best approach to sit around and wait to see how many crashes occur and then go back and evaluate that specific situation? I think that kind of research is needed, but I also think, given the sparse nature of things like pedestrian crash data, is it valuable for us to understand perceived safety alongside measured safety as something we literally take into consideration when we evaluate the project, right? So it's not just like right now we do a good job in terms of looking at if we have countermeasures that can then decrease, let's say, three fatalities, and what is that three fatalities worth in terms of economic dollars versus the dollars invested in improving the infrastructure. I think that is still really, really important. But what does it mean when we increase the perceived safety for pedestrians along that corridor so that they're more comfortable walking that corridor, so that there are more pedestrians walking that corridor? And there is this like safety and numbers type effect that right now we don't isolate and evaluate in our project evaluation. So I do think in terms of that, that's kind of what motivated us in terms of getting into virtual reality from a safety perspective. But I think it's much more than that. I think virtual reality, the way that it can really, immerse someone in something that they're currently unfamiliar with. Yes, it's not 100% the real product, but it's pretty darn close. And when you're in there, we have all these surveys that ask how realistic did this experience feel for you? And for the most part, whether it's the pedestrian simulator or the biking simulator, people say, it proxies my feeling in the real world. So just being able to take that kind of immersion to anything in transportation where we're evaluating a future scenario, a future design, a future technology, a future interaction that we can't evaluate in the field today without some kind of high cost incubator type idea. I think this is where a lot of its value can lie. So yeah, right now we're starting with public involvement because I think a lot of state departments of transportation are starting to see the value of going beyond just 2D visualization. So exploring what does it mean to have effective public engagement using virtual reality. I think right now what we see is that most agencies measure their level of interaction with the public by things like how many people attend the meetings, how many comments do they make on the map that I showed them, and that's a good place to start, but it's not very user centric. What did they actually feel, right? Like, what is it they actually felt? So I think when we think about what those metrics could be when we use virtual reality technology and we can measure things like their gaze, their heart rate, maybe even their stress levels, if we have the right sensors, we can ask, them to give us location-specific feedback as they're interacting with a specific stimuli in the environment. All of these things can maybe also better inform how we evaluate public engagement. Because, I mean, I don't want to be too cynical, but right now I feel like we do it when we evaluate public engagement. It's like, did we do it? And did a sufficient number of people come to the meeting? And were there no major complaints? That's pretty much like the three sets of questions in the logic now. And I think we could probably do a bit better.
Mm. I almost get the sense when we're talking about these technologies, like we're trying to do an end run around the tyranny of empiricism about like the need to be data driven. Because I guess I get the sense that this data that you collect either through AR wearable devices or VR is an effective supplement to a subjective piece of data that has been around forever, and that's the interview. But it's almost as if we don't really take people's experiences very seriously, or at least we give it much less value compared to other data metrics or even modeling. So, I get the sense that you understand it more as a complement to those forms of data rather than a check on it per se. Um, Nonetheless, do you feel like um, the industry or the way that we approach transportation design right now is sort of too data focused to the extent, and maybe as a result of that, too focused on like personal vehicles?
Ooh, that's a complicated question.
It is. Yeah. No, I
I
figured
don't think
go
I would
easy.
ever argue that anything can be too data focused. I think the question is what kinds of data are you considering and what kind of metrics are you considering? When it comes to interview, qualitative data is still data. I think the issue is that right now our decision frameworks mostly lie in quantitative decision making frameworks, and sometimes it can be difficult to tie that qualitative data and integrate it into those quantitative decision networks. Uh, but I will also say that I wouldn't say that it's like we've ignored interview information, but that the nature of interview information makes it that it's difficult to make it consistent across different users. So I mean, I guess we do a lot of survey research. So I'll just give the example of like when you ask someone to rate something on a scale to 0 to 5, and maybe you tie some verbal descriptors to those ratings. 5 is very strongly, 1 is not very strongly. But some people have, they feel like they're someone who's very moderated in how they feel about things, and they never rate anything in the extremes. That everything is always like neutral or, like maybe just one side of neutral. But other people feel like they have very strong opinions about things and everything's a 1 or a 5. And it's really difficult to be able to take that kind of qualitative data and translate it in a quantitative way. And I think this is where the physiological metrics can help, right? So in this way, we can say, but how much did their behavior actually change from a user perspective, right? Maybe they strongly feel this way relative to somebody else who said they only moderately felt this way, but actually their physiological response was pretty similar. What do we take? How do we interpret that data and plug that into our decision-making framework? As to the question of whether or not our transportation system has been too auto-centric, I think I think yes. I mean, I think there is no question about that. But I do think that right now transportation researchers all around the country are highly aware of the fact that generally speaking, at least on the safety side, we have done a much better job protecting vehicle occupants compared to those outside of vehicles. And this is going to be a growing issue if we don't try to address it in some kind of proactive way that's maybe a little faster than our case by case before and after studies. And I'm not saying we have the answer right here in our lab, but we are trying to contribute to that work, asking the question of can we look at those metrics a little bit differently? Do we need to wait for someone to actually have a crash and measure the injuries before we can say that is actually a, concerning corridor, a high stress corridor, a place that could be high risk, a place that is very uncomfortable for pedestrians? I mean, I think all of these things can motivate infrastructure change without having to wait for people to actually get hurt and then decide, oh, the economic costs of the crash are too high.
Mm. I want to go back for a moment to uh, virtual reality as a tool to improve public engagement because in your previous response just then, it almost sounded like these tools are almost a way to improve the quality and perhaps even the good faith of public engagement responses. It's been discussed kind of ad nauseum in recent media profiles and things of that nature about how people will essentially exploit the public engagement process as it stands now to um, halt developments. So, do you imagine this as a tool to potentially validate or perhaps contradict some of the bad faith arguments against certain development projects?
I mean, so I do think we live in an environment right now where community trust is kind of at an all-time low, and particularly trust in government, I would say. So part of this is very much so trying to improve the line of communication between the people with a intense technical training background that are presenting the information to the public that's receiving the information and usually have zero engineering training background, as we should not expect them to. So part of this is the ability to put everybody on the same page, right? Like, here is the thing that we designed, here we put it into virtual reality, and here you go put yourself in it and tell us what you think. I think the other portion of this though is, right now we are doing this project particularly for one public involvement meeting to try to, and the idea is kind of traditional. It's like we've got the mostly the design is done. Um, Here, experience it, let us know if you have feedback, and build that trust. But I also think there is great opportunity to incorporate this even earlier on in the design stage. So future research, I hope, because it is relatively inexpensive to put together and short time to put together these virtual environments. And when you're doing it internally, let's say we're not even at the stage where we want to present this to the public, and we just want to kind of internally think about what alternatives look like amongst a group of design engineers. It looks like one thing when we just have it in 2D plans or maybe even in a rendering, but maybe it's something entirely different when we're in the design experiencing it. And for those types of visualizations, we don't need, it's not going to be as beautiful as the version we bring to the public with all the scaled trees and the textured buildings. It can just be the roadway with, proposed geometry, proposed striping, and interactions with other infrastructure. I think there's even opportunity to bring this kind of visualization in earlier in the process so that even the design engineers themselves can interact with it as a user, not just as a designer, but as a user, and think about whether the thing that they intended in the design they're actually achieving by experience of virtual reality. So that is what we hope the long-term prospect of this is it just becomes a part of this design feedback loop. And then at that point, maybe it's possible to even bring the public in earlier, when they're just evaluating potentially different alternatives. We can say, here's a couple of them that we're considering seriously. You can try to experience it and tell us, do you like one better than the other? Are there improvements we can make to make it more of something that you would utilize in a way that's comfortable?
I think this idea of a design feedback loop has a lot of merit because I know one of the ways that cost overruns and delays for transportation projects tend to stack up is there's an issue between the designers and the contractors who are often two different firms, and there needs to be a design change, and there's a whole request and approval process that takes a long time, and they often have to go through this process multiple times. So any effort that would reduce the number of times that has to do that, or perhaps facilitate quicker permitting and approval around those, seems to me like just an excellent idea on its face.
Yeah, and I also think if you think about all of the different parties involved in coordinating a design, transportation project, there's the transportation designers themselves, but other stakeholders that already have infrastructure in that, in that vicinity, whether it's an adjacent parcel business owner or it's the utilities. But the idea is that you have this consistent information that you're presenting to everybody who might be a stakeholder in those earlier on iterations where there's still decisions to be made. I think right now it's just not something that agencies really necessarily think about earlier on because they tend to think of visualization as a thing they do at the end for the public portion. But really, if you do sort of a scaled back version earlier on, it can also be very useful to internal agency operations. And then it'll be a more natural and maybe efficient transition to then making that virtual environment public ready for when it is time to present to the public.
Right, right. Much more robust stakeholder management tool, essentially.
Exactly.
Um, I wanted to ask you, when you're looking back at your own journey going from um, working as a consultant in the private sector to moving into academia and now thinking about these sort of stakeholder management problems. What are some things that have surprised you the most about human behavior as they move through transportation systems?
That they don't behave like robots, darn it. Yeah, so as much as engineers love to have absolute, quantities or quantitative perspectives on everything, I think transportation decisions, whether it's behavioral decisions, whether it's how people decide where they're going to travel, when they're going to travel, what mode they're going to take, these things are influenced by a lot of things that are outside of the control of transportation engineers, and I think we make peace with that, but it becomes hard for us when we still need to put in a value into the model. What is the value going to be? um, so we have historically measured things like, or tried to influence things by looking at things like roadway capacity, travel time, maybe cost, like transit fares. But they're really complex and they require both that systems perspective, which I would say transportation engineers have a pretty good grasp on because we love measuring things at a large scale. But also, even though there's a lot of complexity, it is worthwhile to try to understand those individual user perspectives, especially in context. I would say that, with the kind of computing availability to us now and the kinds of big data available to us now, this is more possible than ever, but it takes, I would say, some purposeful action for us to integrate the research portion where we say we can understand these things using this different kinds of data, but what is the translatable action into then our decision making frameworks that actually influence the infrastructure we have, in the real world?
hmm What do you have any answers to that question? Like, are there any assumptions that this technology has revealed were maybe false? Like you said, people don't act like robots, but were we maybe expecting people to in certain situations that they turn out not to? I guess as revealed
I
by
would say
technology.
that right now, I would say the thing that transportation researchers love to say is we don't know what they might do on an individual level, but an aggregate level, our models are pretty accurate in terms of the range of estimates. And I don't disagree with that. I think that is where forecasting models at a large scale can be very effective. But when it comes down to those smaller locations, right? That's when it kind of falls apart, like the specific context of that particular location versus like a city, a metropolitan area as a whole. It may not be those assumptions that you have always made. I don't know that I have a great answer for this. I mean, I think we don't have enough understanding from that user perspective to be able to answer that question effectively right now.
hmm All right, always my last question. When you are talking to your students or perhaps anybody who might be interested in not only learning about transportation systems, but applying the technologies that we've been exploring here today, what advice would you give them to sort of get in on the ground floor?
Mm. I would say, even though we have had a lot of criticisms of how we've done things in the past in transportation engineering, it is really important for someone entering this field to understand the theory and the math and the models that contributed to the world we have outside our doors and windows today. These things, the assumptions behind these things in the models, understanding how these decisions are made, so that you can then understand if there are technologies or social trends that may then change the underlying assumptions that we have in those models and theories, right? So that's maybe how it's going to be different in the future. One thing I always tell my students is, as a transportation engineer, you probably can never get away with just sitting around doing equations and calling it a day. You have to be able to communicate with people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So, first, being able to communicate with your fellow technical audience, really, really important. We have different methodologies for the way we do things. Why is it that we are choosing a particular way to do something? We need to be able to explain that effectively. You need to be able to talk to stakeholders, decision makers. A lot of times these are, politicians, representatives, what it is, understanding what it is that they care about and how your design or your decisions may impact the ultimate thing that they care about, which is probably not the same thing that you care about, makes a lot, makes your life easier if you can kind of understand their perspective. And then lastly, you are going to be engaging with the public. In what capacity, I'm not sure, but I think you can't get away with it if you're going to be a transportation engineer. And you must be able to translate your ideas, at least at a high level, to someone that doesn't have that technical engineering background. How can you explain it in a way that really feels like it has a real impact on their day-to-day travels and what it is that you're trying to do to improve, the overall situation of the particular site that you're talking about? Yeah.
Wonderful. I really, really appreciate the emphasis on stakeholder management. I think it is really underrated, and transportation is a project-driven field, or anything related to infrastructure, really. So I really appreciate your emphasis on that. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Chen, and I appreciate your ability to communicate effectively as we go through this whirlwind of VR, AR, and similar wearable technologies. It's a really exciting spot in the transportation field, and I think you walked us through it very effectively. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for inviting me on the show today.
Of course. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today.